As a follow-up to our last episode where we talked about how squatting is not really a pattern, we're going to talk today about squatting being used as a diagnostic tool in assessment. We're also going to talk about the phases of propulsion inside of the squat and just demonstrate it through the squat. And then we'll touch a little bit on and finish with a brief introduction to strategic resistance for how we load the squat. All of that and more on this week's episode of
Welcome to Reconsider. I'm Bill Hartman. This is the podcast to challenge you to ask better questions, to look beyond traditional models of thinking and arrive at better health and fitness solutions.
So last time we talked a bit about sort of breaking this concept of squatting being this pattern that everyone has to be able to display, and expecting everyone to kind of fit square pegs into round holes with this squatting pattern. So let's get into using squatting as an assessment. Let's talk about some of the common things that people look for or see when they're squatting, and then maybe what they really mean. For instance, weight coming off the heels, right or left shifts, the quote unquote butt wink that you see in a lot of people. Let's talk about those. What people think that they're looking for when they use squatting as an assessment and what they're actually seeing.
As a complex movement, it's useful as a comparator. And we kind of talked about this before, that it's not whether you can or whether you can't, it's a how, as to how you're squatting. So the assumption is that anything that is deep, as far as like the amount of descent that you demonstrate, is the concern. And I would argue that, well, there's certain elements that have to be in play to access the deepest portion of the squat, which is I have to have enough space to squat into, and then I have to be able to superimpose the deceleration, which is the amount of internal rotation that you're applying. And so what we want to do is we want to see how these people create the space to squat. So that's your external rotation that you have available to you. And then how do you superimpose the internal rotation? And so what we're going to see then at the bottom is, well, how do they create the CR space? And so when you talk about a posterior orientation of the pelvis and a rounding of the spine, what that is an exaggeration of a compensation for making space. So that is actually the external rotation component. So you see someone's legs deviate away from midline, or you see them set up in a squat. Like you just tell somebody to squat, they immediately move their legs apart, knowing full well that they don't have enough space within the current base of support to descend into a squat. And so what they do is they actually create more space to do so. And so what we're trying to identify is, okay, where do they create these compensations? And then how do they superimpose the IR and the ER? Because what that's going to do is, if we make comparisons to isolated movements, which we would refer to in our table test, we should start to see the correlation between the strategy that they're using to access whatever variation of a squat that they can produce. And this would allow us to again correlate with the table test, especially for people that don't do regular table tests. You still need to understand them, so you understand how these movements are captured. But as you get better and better at identifying these things, and you start to see the correlation in the squat, we can use the squat more effectively in our, and I hesitate to use this word diagnosis, but we'll go ahead and use that in our diagnosis as to how they are performing the squat.
It's still hard. So coming from my perspective as a coach, trainer, not a PT, but I sort of understand. And that idea of, it's easy to sort of listen to Bill say that. You need to understand them and just be like, oh, well, I don't really need to. I'm just going to kind of I'm just going to do complex moves with people. But it's important to know, if you're ever going to try to get to a point where you're trying to develop interventions and progressions for people from a programming and intervention standpoint, and you're not understanding what your expectations for ERs and IRs might be in different positions of early and late, you don't really have a way to check your interventions against something. You could always use your complex movements as the test retest. But when it comes to choosing your interventions, if you know which interventions are going to give you certain measures back, it can help you be a little more precise with execution and integration of this stuff. Another thing I want to try to talk about, maybe procedural aspects of having someone do a squat assessment, because I think a lot of times people are looking at a checklist of things. They want to see like a flat back, or they want to see squatting a certain way. keeping their heels down. If you're trying to use this as a comparator and also allow them to sort of show you what their behavior is, you need to offer as little coaching as possible, I think.
Certainly at first.
Yeah, at first, if you're trying to get like the best
because you don't
representation.
you don't want to interfere with the strategy at first, because you want to get a truer representation of what this person is capable of doing, and the more you coach it, then the less real it would be.
Yeah.
Right. And then you might miss something that would be important to understand as far as a compensatory strategy would be, because you're giving them, by giving them instructions, like you are a constraint that is part of the interaction. And so if I say, put your feet here, now if I understand why I'm putting feet in certain positions, that's a little bit of a different story. But initially, just let people do what they would do. Let them take their own perceptions of what the instructions are, and then just execute, and you'll get a much clearer picture of what their typical strategy would be.
Right. And what, if you could give an example of what might the words you use to set somebody up be? Like, what would you say to somebody?
The first thing I actually do is I just say squat.
Okay.
Because people have a general idea of what that might be.
Yeah.
And so literally it's the minimum of instruction, and just to see what, and again, their perceptions matter. It's like, so, they might, again, make the assumption that there's a certain way that you wanted to do it. So you're going to see their interpretation of what you're asking them to do. And if it's so far off from, anything that you had in mind, then certainly you can add cues. But again, I would say don't constrain them. Let them do whatever it is they perceive that they're supposed to do, because people will naturally adopt certain positions. You'll see the external rotation before they even start to descend into the squat, because they know they probably tried to squat at some point in time in their life, and then they do what they do. And so, like, you tell somebody to squat, you see the heels come off the ground, they're up on the forefoot, knees obviously tracking forward, and then they descend. That might be their perception of what the squat is. And so in that circumstance, what I might say is like, okay, now I want you to squat with your whole foot on the floor.
Yeah.
Right? Again, I'm adding the minimum of cues because I just want to see what their tendency would be. So you have somebody that lifts their heels, goes up on their forefoot. You have a sense that, okay, they're more comfortable in this forward projection type of a behavior versus somebody that can actually slow the system down into a squat. And then you see the difference between the two. And so this is the difference between, say, doing a heels elevated squat with the forefoot on the ground versus actually squatting with the foot flat. It's like, what can they do? What are they most comfortable doing? Because whatever they represent is going to be the typical.
Yeah.
And the reason they choose that is because in many cases they have to.
So then the squat assessment becomes less about this rigid representation that you're looking for from everybody. Right. You want a full squat. You want to have chest up, shoulders back. And you're asking for the most authentic version of what they perceive as a squat. And then you can try to use coaching cues to see how adaptable this person is, being able to change what you're looking for. And you might clean up someone's squat just by telling them to do the right things. That'll give you information in terms of adaptability for the person, and just your how easy it will be for you as you intervene to kind of move this person within their base of support. So the common things that people are going to see: squat, heels coming off the ground, the low back rounding at the bottom, and then like a shift from right to left. So let's just go through like one by one and sort of briefly say what.
So let me jump ahead into that before we get into those kind of examples. Situations where people are trying to control their center of gravity inside of their base of support, and you see somebody reach forward, like you don't tell them to do this, but they automatically know that if I try to squat, I'm going to fall backwards. And so what these people do is they'll reach forward, they'll project their head forward, they'll extend the arms forward to displace mass in that direction, so they can actually create the slowdown that they need to actually descend into the squat. You take that away, and then they're projecting. And so they automatically do some of these things. but the common representations that you're going to see, extremities turning away from midline. Okay, so that's me looking for the space to actually sit down into the squat. And we talked about the posterior orientation that creates more space for me to squat. You can't just isolate, say, oh, their pelvis is shifting to the left, their pelvis is shifting to the right, because we've got multiple representations of strategy that could produce both of those. It's not just a singular reason. Like, oh, I see them shifting to the right. Well, there could be a number of things that would be associated with that, in representative to like thorax position relative to pelvis position. It could just be that the spine and the sacrum are oriented into a right facing direction. Well, that actually creates a leftward position of the pelvis in the descent of the squat, right? I could have somebody that has a center of gravity that's shifted back towards the right heel in a squat. That would produce a right shift. But I could also have a thorax that's turning to the right faster than the pelvis. That would also produce a right shift. So we have two different strategies that produce what appears to be, based on what we're looking at, that appears to be the same thing, and they're not the same thing. And so, again, this is why understanding upper extremity representations in thorax behaviors and pelvis behaviors will help us sort of resolve their strategy that they're executing with. And so you can't just say, oh, it's a right shift, there's a solution for that. It's like, well, there is, but is this the actual representation that you're seeing, or is there something that's additive to that that's also producing this so-called right or left shift?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that if you're looking for it, it can maybe put you in the ballpark. And then this is another example of the need for more specific testing of like table tests and table measures, because you can create a general idea of how someone looks, how they're moving around, what their potential limitations might be, but it gives you a framework to sort of check against another set of data.
And while we're focused on the squat, we have a number of complex movements that we would use.
Right.
That would also, so from a consistency, it's like if someone uses a behavioral strategy to hold a position or move into and out of a position, you're going to see that repeated throughout the complex movement. So we do have other frames that allow us to sort of resolve what we would have seen in the squat itself.
Yeah, and just use this as an opportunity to promote, since we don't do the best job of this, the assessment. So we're at the end of creating the Assessment 101 course, which is going to be a free course on the UHP network. And we go through a lot of these table tests and the complex movements that Bill and I have been talking about, give you a general idea of how to use them to determine where, when you're assessing someone, that person might be in space, the relationships between the measures and being narrow and wide, how you would check the complex movements against your table tests and use them as comparators in your assessment. And then there's actually a pretty cool example of a case study at the end of the course that we get into a little more specifically, how we use this stuff to interpret what to do with someone, where to start with somebody. So yeah, that's uhp.network. That would be one of 4 free courses that will be up there. The Model 101 course, the Decision Making course, the Anatomy 101 course, and then the Assessment 101, which will be coming out soon. Let's talk a little bit about squat. So a lot of people try to use gait analysis, and sometimes people try to integrate it into other movements. So you throwing a baseball into a gait model, or squatting, for instance. Let's talk really briefly about why gait it's more about early, middle, and late propulsion than it is about early, middle, and late stance. I know we've talked about this lots of times, but real briefly, we'll get into why that difference is important to understand and appreciate. And then let's talk about how the squat represents those 3 phases in the transitions.
Right. So we're talking about moving forward through space in contact with the medium when we're talking about propulsion. So walking would be one representation of propulsion. And so rather than trying to relate it to walking is just one small sector of this representation. And so we'll see the same phases of propulsion represented in the squat. And so when you think about your first squat as a very young person, it's a bottom up representation, and so your ability to slow the system down becomes the most important part of that. And so that's why you would start from the bottom of a squat. So your first squat was start at the bottom and then stand up, which is you overcoming gravity, pushing down into the ground. So we have an early propulsive representation at the bottom of the squat. You stand upright into middle propulsion, which is where you're pushing straight down into the ground, right? So forward becomes that direction. Whereas the initial descent was, I need to be able to slow my system down from going forward, and then I can push down into the ground. To initiate the squat, you have to project yourself forward first, and then you slow down, and that's actually what becomes the deepest representation of a squat. So we go early at the bottom, middle to stand, and then we initiate the squat again by going forward. And that allows us to see the typical upright position of the top down squat. And I think we mentioned this last time. If you think about how you land from a standing broad jump, so if you jump forward as far as you possibly can, and you'll see this in like long jumps where they land in the sand pit, it's like that representation where your feet are actually ahead of the center of gravity and you have to decelerate into the ground. That is your earliest representation of propulsion. And then, of course, just stand up and repeat.
Right. So squatting as an assessment will be the late, middle, early from the top down. What you were talking
late,
about.
early, middle. Actually, you can stop it in the middle and make it a middle propulsive representation. But if you were just to descend, you would go a late to early, and then middle would be to come back up, because
right.
you're slowing the center of gravity down once you project forward. And it's a very small projection, obviously, for a squat, but you have to be moving forward to descend. Otherwise, you can't. Because think about it, if I'm standing upright in middle propulsion and I'm directing a force straight down, it's like I have to be able to project that forward. Then I can actually slow the system down to assume the deep squat.
Right. And then if you create a constraint where, say, you're hanging off of like a TRX and you're well behind your foot, that allows you to display a more early squat first.
Yes. Anything that would be reclined where you can represent the feet ahead of the center of gravity is going to bias it. And it's like, so if I project myself upward from the bottom of, say, a TRX squat, I'm still applying the IR associated with middle propulsion, but to a lesser degree. And right. So this is why we use those things, because what we want to do is we want to manipulate how much of this downforce that someone needs to or can apply.
So the starting at the top in a late representation,
mm-hmm.
as you get to the midpoint or the sticking point of the squat on the descent, mm-hmm. it's a more IR position, but it's not a middle position. Is that what you're
saying? You're accumulating internal rotation to slow the forward progression of the center of gravity.
Right.
So it's not a representation of middle, because in early propulsion is an ER bias with a superimposition of the IR. So that's what you're actually doing on the descent. And like I said, you can stop the squat halfway down, but to do that, you actually have to project greater downforce to actually come to a stop. And so again, not to create confusion, it's like, how are you executing? It becomes the question mark.
So a squat, if I'm only doing half of a squat,
mm-hmm.
I'm going from late to middle with a yield back to late.
Yep.
Okay. So that's important.
Late internal rotation to stand up.
Yeah, late internal rotation.
If I am pushing into the ground and I'm moving the center of gravity away from the ground, I have to increase the amount of, this would be late internal rotation, which is my ability to project myself into pushing down into the ground.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that also, I don't want this to seem like a conversation where we're saying that in order to access early propulsion with somebody, or in order to reacquire early propulsion, that person or everyone needs to squat all the way to the bottom, just because it's not going to happen for a lot of people.
It's very rare that someone has that capacity to do that without some form of manipulation of body position, ground contact, or load.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good segue, actually. Before we move on to like strategic resistance and inputs, different types of inputs to create the bias that we're talking about. I said we were going to talk about it and we didn't. Let's talk about why it's not, these things are not, we can't really talk about these phases in terms of stance, just why the language difference is important to understand.
Right. Because our system is designed to always be moving forward.
Yeah.
And so if we're always in a state of problem solving that scenario, then we are always propelling, which means that we're moving forward. And so stance implies some imaginary static position, and we just don't have that capacity to do so.
Yeah, like if it was stop, you were stopped. And if you were to stop in any of these positions too, you're, like you had mentioned, you have that that implies and involves a certain degree of downforce. So then now you're more IR'd.
For sure. Well, you have to squeeze yourself harder to hold the position.
Yeah.
Right. And so then you have to magnify your application of force into the ground in that circumstance.
Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, so next episode we're definitely going to get more into archetypes and squatting choices and really expand on what we're about to introduce. But let's talk a little bit about like a brief introduction to strategic resistance. And for the most part, people think about squatting as like using the form of squatting, keeping people's weight in their heels. I'm going to talk about from a more traditional or legacy sense here, not how we would view squatting, but chest up, shoulders back. Some people push your knees out, stick your butt back type of squat to make sure you keep your weight in your heels. That sort of concept of everyone needs to squat the same way is not going to be, you're going to run out of usefulness for that pretty quick unless the person that you're dealing with would be sort of genetically or structurally predisposed to squatting that way. So yeah, let's kind of talk about how we would utilize like ramps and load, I guess. Let's start with that, just as some examples.
Okay. So if I put my feet on a ramp, so this is the entire foot supported on the decline. So if I'm using a ramp, so think about what the ramp does to you first. So what the ramp actually does is it projects you forward. And so if you don't want to fall, then you have to create a yielding action. And this is primarily done via the response. So if I'm projected forward, that would imply a compressive strategy on the posterior aspect of my body that would push me in that direction. And so what I have to do then is I have to create a slowdown. And so I have a couple of options as far as that goes, but the overall strategy is I'm going to create some measure of connective tissue behavior that actually slows me down. So it's an expanded representation of connective tissue. And that allows me to bring the center of gravity from its most anterior representation to back inside of the base of support, which would imply that I'm actually slowing it down. And then that would allow me to descend into the squat more effectively, because then I would have space to superimpose the internal rotation that I use to push into the ground to slow down.
Right.
And that's why you see the proliferation of ramps. It's why you've always seen people using some measure of heel elevation in that circumstance, because their capacity to access a space, which would be the deepest part of the squat, requires an increase in the external rotation space. And so that's what that projection is. That projection actually creates more space for me to squat. There's for my deceleration. I expand the system posteriorly, brings the center of gravity back, and then there's my descent within my base of support.
Yeah, and I want to get into next time when we do a little more of a deep dive into the strategic resistance stuff. I want to get into why a heel elevated squat, like putting your heels up on plates, is a different representation than putting your feet on a ramp with your toes flat on the ground. Um, so yeah, we talk a little bit about the heel elevation and the foot position and ramps and that type of input is going to help shift the center of gravity and also maybe create some space to set someone up to be able to have a more capability to move through that space. And then we also can superimpose load in a strategic way to either assist us or force a shift or create a gradient in a certain direction. So let's talk a bit. Use a couple examples of that. So maybe like a goblet squat and
let's compare a goblet squat to a plate reach.
Yeah.
Because they're both anterior loads. Okay, but different outcomes. Okay, so because we're increasing the load anteriorly, that's going to draw the center of gravity in the direction of the resistance. So that's the natural response to any form of anterior load. But because of the position of the extremities and thorax with a goblet, so it's closer to you, it's a more ER'd, externally rotated representation in a goblet squat. And with that ER bias, that's going to be a much more effective use to access the early propulsive position of squat, which is the deepest portion. When I use a plate reach, so I take a barbell plate and I reach straight forward, I'm actually creating a more internally rotated representation with the same yielding capabilities. And so this is why you'll see much easier access to what would typically be associated with like the thighs parallel to the floor type of a squat. Squatting below that level will tend to, once again, recruit an external rotation compensatory strategy to gain further depth. And so if I was trying to favorably influence the internally rotated position, I would use a plate squat as the strategic load, whereas if I was trying to get deeper than that without the compensatory strategy, I would use the goblet squat.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, we'll get into a lot more examples next time, and we'll talk about archetype specific squatting and some do's and don'ts there. But yeah, I think this gave people a pretty good idea of how to use squatting as a different way to look at squatting as an assessment tool, and sort of understanding the early, middle, and late propulsive representations of the squat. So let's. I made a list of questions, so we have something to go off of. I use Chat. I'll admit that I use ChatGPT to help me, but what discontinued, so everyone in the audience, we want you to answer this in the comments. What discontinued fast food item do you still think about?
Oh, I got easy.
Yeah. What's yours?
And it's not discontinued. It's just an annual thing.
Ah, okay.
My wife is from the South. And so every time the McRib shows up at McDonald's, we make a one time a year trip to McDonald's.
It's never good. The McRib's amazing because you'll always want to give it another shot, and you'll think like, maybe the last time. Yeah, maybe the last time was just a bad one. It wasn't warm enough. Like I've had too many bad McRib experiences to make it worth it. It's just also too like, if you live in any market where barbecue is a thing, or you've had barbecue before from like Austin, or you've gone to New York City and had
Memphis.
It's not.
I had some amazing barbecue in Memphis.
If you've had ribs in Memphis, like you're not having anything. I don't know. So I guess there's some nostalgia factor there, but I've never been a big fan of that. I had a lot of instances when I was growing up where I got sick eating that, I think. But yeah, for me, like I was thinking about this as I read that question. The thing that just pops into my head is the weirdest thing. So I'm sure there are other 90s kids from the US that are listening to this. That The Wendy's, I coming back from karate class, I would get like Wendy's or McDonald's because they were on the way, and I would always get the chicken seed. Do you remember the pitas at Wendy's? Like they used to have a bunch of pita sandwiches.
Vaguely.
So that was a thing in the 90s for some reason, like pitas and Greek and food and hummus, and became like this big thing that everyone understood what it was all of a sudden. So that was like the chicken Caesar pita with like the biggie fry and either like orange, like Hi-C or orange soda, or the chocolate frosty. That was like what I would get
There you
after.
go.
Or the quarter pounder with cheese meal, or the double cheeseburger meal at McDonald's, which at the time was like $2.60.
Nice.
Yeah, those are my go-to. So yeah, if you remember, if something jumps out to you as like the fast food that doesn't exist anymore that you can remember, just post that in the comments.